Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to The Print. I have with me today award-winning documentary filmmaker and also an author, Mr. Iqbal Chand Malhotra. His latest book is a Bloomsbury publication, and we have nicely covered it for you. We are going to launch it in The Print's soft cover, and it's a wonderful book called The Red Fear, The China Threat. And it's a very timely book, I must say, when India is facing a lot of challenges from China and the fact that we are facing a border standoff, which is into its 6th month, I would say. But we are also seeing the kind of changes that's happening. But to begin with, Mr. Malhotra, if I can ask you, what would you say in let's say in a shorter format about the book, and what made you sort of trace back the history to 15th century, which is something I think the readers would also want to know. It's very interesting to understand because we read a very less of Oriental history, but what made you go back to 15th century?
Well, I have been studying the history of this Chinese Admiral Zheng He, who was supposed to have, in fact, been the pioneer. Some people claim that he also discovered North America before Columbus. And I came across a very interesting insight about several years ago that he had, stolen the sovereignty of Sri Lanka. And he had kidnapped the king and taken him back to China. And then after the king of Sri Lanka had sort of accepted the suzerainty of the Chinese emperor, he'd been released and permitted to go back. So I began some research on that just out of a sense of curiosity. And I discovered that not only did this man Zheng He visit Sri Lanka, but he visited India 6 times between in the first 35 years of the 15th century during the reign of the early Ming emperors. And not only did he visit India, but he'd also interfered in the politics of the Indian heartland. Now, it's very interesting that there's a kingdom of Jaunpur, and Jaunpur is a part of central India. And this kingdom had a king called Raja Ganesh, and he threatened the Sultan of Bengal. And the Chinese fleet sailed up the Ganges, up to Jaunpur, and showed the flag. In those days, the rivers were different and much broader and much deeper and not so polluted. And you could navigate all the way up to Delhi. And that was the time of the end of the Tughlaq dynasty and, the start of the Sayyids. North India was in a disarray and there was a kind of a power vacuum. But the Chinese obviously didn't have very good intelligence. Otherwise, they could have sailed right up to New Delhi. And, then kind of exercise some kind of proto-suzerainty over India. Fortunately for us that they went back from Jaunpur and they went back down the Hooghly. But they established their presence. And I was very curious as to why this happened and then why didn't they follow up with it. And that was because, they withdrew back into their society. They disbanded their navy because they faced a threat on their northern borders from the Mongols. So I said, this is quite interesting that this man comes here to India with a fleet of 200 ships. He makes 6 voyages and he obtains obedience from Calicut, Cochin, Bengal, and Jaunpur. So that's how it actually started. And then, there's this whole story of the Opium Wars and how the British used Indian opium to kind of, enslave China and use the receipts from the sale of opium to pay for tea. So that's how it actually started. And I remember when I was 6 years old in the 1962 war, I used to sit in front of the radio with my grandmother every evening and listen to All India Radio and about the conduct of the war and how many Indians were captured. And we were all very inspired to fight the Chinese. And then over the years, I've been to China, I've been to Tibet, I've traveled around and I've made films. And I felt that last year that this was an opportune time to write about China because China was the elephant in the room. In fact, at my last book launch last year, I mentioned that fact that China is going to be on the center stage, and we are going to face this manifest challenge from the Chinese in 2020. And I was prophetic.
Mhm. That's interesting that you talk about how you felt about China at a very early age, and I've read the preface. You have a very interesting childhood where you made this travel from Mumbai to Delhi, and how things have changed, and how in school you were made to sing all this patriotic songs. Then also your visit to your maternal uncle, Lieutenant General Bhagat's house. And that's a very fascinating way of looking into things from a very early age. Would you like to tell our viewers a little bit about that, and then we will do a deep dive into the book?
Well, I was basically in the preface recounting my brushes with Chinese civilization, right from the age of 5 years old, when I met my first Chinese individual who was a seller of linen called Hop Sing, and he used to, in the old days, before the 1962 war, these Chinese tradesmen used to come from door to door selling linen. The Kashmiri fellow used to come to selling shawls. And by 1960, when the tension with China arose, a lot of these chaps left India. And this man was the first Chinese guy I ever met, and he offered me a sweet. And I always remember that fact, that he gave me a very nice peppermint sweet. And it was a sweet beginning, but then it turned sour. And then over the years, when I went to Calcutta, my uncle was in the Air Force. And he used to be flying, suddenly go off flying one morning and then come back. Then the next day, he'd again go off flying without any advance notice. And we used to ask him that, where did you go? So he said, son, I used to just buzz the Chinese at the base of Mount Everest. So this whole story then evolved. I was in school leaving school when this Naxalite violence started. And there was this great fascination with Chairman Mao. And everybody was in college supposed to be a lefty. But for me, actually, I was more fascinated with the actress Mumtaz in those days than Chairman Mao, and I'd rather hung a photograph of hers on my bedroom wall than Chairman Mao's. And then I visited China, so I just thought I'd introduce the readers to my back history, my backstory as to why I wanted to write this book.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I wrote the preface, and it's a very personalized account. So it gives the reader an understanding of my understanding of China, and how I have brushed close to China, over the last 50 years myself.
Well, that's definitely quite fascinating. So now, sort of, going into the book a bit, I believe the first thing that that is something that strikes you when you read about the book is how you sort of talked about the first ever kind of a military confrontation between India and China. And that time it was, of course, British India in 1840 in the month of July at the coastal town of Dinghai. I understand that that's been the first encounter, but that was under, China was under this empire king, and India was under the British Raj. But how do you still see it in today's perspective? If you can talk a little bit, how do you relate the two?
The Chinese had a metaphor that the British dog wags an Indian tail. Now they hated the British, and they hated us because we enforced the writ of the British Empire. It was the Indian troops, the Indian NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and JCOs, junior commissioned officers, that actually established the writ of the British Empire from Aden in the west to Singapore in the east, down to Sri Lanka in the south, and in the northeast, right up to Beijing. Now, once Indian troops landed in China in 1840, they left 100 years later in 1939. And they were an army of occupation, albeit with British officers, but they were Indian soldiers. And soldiers can be brutal. And in the 19th century, wars were brutal and soldiers were brutal. And there were many wars fought. There was the first Opium War, there was the second Opium War, then there was the Boxer Rebellion. And in the Boxer Rebellion, in fact, even the Maharaja of Bikaner, the Maharaja of Gwalior, and Sir Pratap, who was the Prime Minister of Jodhpur state, they participated in the war. They went to China. And in fact, the Jodhpur Lancers, famous Jodhpur Lancers battalion, when they charged the tradition was that the commanding officer would strike first blood, and the rest of the cavalry charge would have their lances reversed. So it was only when Sir Pratap struck the first Chinese soldier and struck first blood with his spear, did the rest of the cavalry then reverse their spears and plunged into the Chinese. So, I mean, that war was fought again with Indian officers, and, so the Indian society began to participate in it. And in the 60 years from 1840 to 1900, the government of India was earning revenue from the sale of opium to China. In fact, almost 15% of the revenues of the government of India came from the sale of opium. The government of India would buy the opium and then sell it. And then the silver that came in as payment for the opium was used to pay for tea. And then what the government of India did was that they sent a spy into China in the 1860s. And he was a botanist, and he came back with about 28,000 tea plants, which were planted in Assam. And then they also brought in around about 30, 40,000 coolies, Chinese coolies, who actually then, harvested the tea, planted the tea, and that's how Indian tea overtook Chinese tea. So the Chinese suddenly found they had no silver to pay for the opium because they had no tea to export, since the British market and the American market was all being fed by Indian grown tea. So they had a big grouse against us. So the Indian army was there to enforce the commercial interests of the British Empire. And as you know, the British Empire had constituent parts. But the British Raj in India had its own mini empire. And it ruled over Aden, it ruled over Sri Lanka, it ruled over Burma, Singapore, Malaysia, China, and it was always the Indian troops, along with some British troops, who actually went to enforce the writ of the British Empire. We were not only growing the opium, but we were selling the opium, and two Indians, one was a gentleman called Mr. David Sassoon from Pune, and the other was Sir Jamshedji Gigi Boy from Bombay. They were the guys who were most actively involved in the sale of opium to China. And in fact, after the first Opium War, reparations and damages were paid by the Chinese government, not only to the government of India, but also to to Mr. Gigi Boy and Mr. Sassoon. And they were then in the retail business as well. In fact, Sassoon had opium dens, which were run by his own family members and own members of his company. So it was a very big enterprise. And the Chinese actually hated us for having, in fact, completely, converted 25% of their population into opium addicts. Mm-hmm. So they had a big grouse. And there was a lot of humiliation because at the same time as this first Opium War treaty was signed in Nanking, the Sikh Empire had encroached into Tibet. General Zorawar Singh had captured land near Lake Mansarovar because, the Himalayas has traditionally been part of our culture, and it's been part of our history and part of our religion. And for some reason, nobody had ever thought that they should, physically take it over because borders had been open. But General Zorawar Singh did that. And at the same time, the Indian army was in Nanking, and the Chinese emperor signed this humiliating treaty. And in fact, the cannons from the Imperial Palace were brought back to Calcutta. You can still see them at Government House in Calcutta. And even the Marxist government of Jyoti Basu refused to return those cannons to the Chinese because it was a sign of Chinese humiliation. So we were there very much in China, and there were Sikh policemen running the police in 7 Chinese cities. So they viewed the Indians as part of this British dog with an Indian tail.
I get your point. And since we were talking about how this dynamic started from, right from the British era, and what you said is very key in terms of how India could have safeguarded maybe the Himalayas from a very early on. I would like to discuss that more with you, and also on the issue of Tibet. Do you see that also as a part of the British legacy, something that could have been negotiated better when they finally left India? Or do you think, that is something history tells us that we should not commit more mistakes? So What is your take on that? And you've put that very interestingly in your book with the arms sales to Tibet and many other things. So if you can focus on that a bit.
Well, Tibet is a very interesting subject because what happened is that the British feared a Russian takeover of Tibet, and they feared a Russian invasion of India from Xinjiang. And they wanted to use the Chinese as a buffer between the government of India and the Russians. So what happened was that for about 60, 70 years, there was this whole great game being fought in the Pamirs and in Afghanistan. And in 1906, there was the Anglo-Russian Convention, which brought this great game to an end and also demarcated the spheres of influence of the British Empire and the Tsarist Empire. Now, as a consequence of that treaty, the government of India could not officially make Tibet into an Indian protectorate. Tibet actually became an Indian protectorate in 1901 when Colonel Younghusband led the Indian army into Lhasa. And a treaty was signed. Lord Curzon was the viceroy at that point of time. And Lord Curzon felt that the interests of the government of India were different from the government of Great Britain. The government of Great Britain was interested in proto-suzerainty over China, but the government of India was interested in protecting its own borders and its own interests. So a treaty was signed, and the government of India was permitted to have 3 military escorts guarding 3 trading outposts in Tibet. The northern outpost was in Gartok, which is today called Yatung, and there was one in Shigatse, and there was another third one near the Sikkim border. Now, because of this Anglo-Russian treaty, the British could not officially say that Tibet was a protectorate of India, but it actually was a protectorate of India because India had extraterritorial rights over Tibet. As per the treaty we signed with the Tibetans in 1901, they could not pursue an independent foreign policy. They could not raise an army beyond a certain extent. They had to accept Indian troops in Tibet, and they had to have some kind of relatively unfavorable terms of trade with the government of India, because the government of India was interested that Indians got more benefits in trading than the Tibetans. And Indian currency was also accepted all the way up to Lhasa. So when we got independence in 1947, Mr. Nehru was very diffident about India taking over the mantle of the British Raj, because India was the successor state of the British Raj. And that's the views that Sardar Patel had. Mr. Nehru viewed India in a very ambivalent term. He felt that India should be the leader of the newly decolonizing countries and the third world and the non-aligned world, because he had this concept of non-alignment in his mind. And like the British brought the Chinese into Tibet in a kind of a demi-official capacity in 1906, the same way Mr. Nehru was interested in bringing the Chinese into Tibet so that he could actually work a defined border with China and also get the Chinese to support his concept of non-alignment. But all that happened was that he was unable to get Mr. Mao Zedong and Mr. Chou En-lai to agree to what were his wishes. And he signed a one-sided treaty in 1954 with the Chinese, which gave Tibet away to them. Now, this whole mythology that's been created about the fact that, the Chinese had to build a road into Tibet, that, to my mind, is a lot of rubbish. Because in 1949, December, 1 month after Mr. Nehru had turned down President Truman's offer of a military pact with the US to contain the spread of the communist empire in China and communism in China, Mao and Stalin worked out a deal whereby the Russians would be allowed to exploit the mineral resources of the Tarim Basin in Xinjiang. Now, the Tarim Basin is a geographical construct that extends into Aksai Chin. It has a river. It had very important raw materials for the nuclear for nuclear energy, like thorium, beryllium, uranium, molybdenum. It had gold. It had oil, and it had the Karkash River. this Karkash River originated in Aksai Chin and went up to join the Tarim River in the Tarim Basin. So the Stalin, who lost 25 million Russians in the Second World War, didn't want to deploy any more men in this region. So he told Mao, he said, I'll fly your troops from central China into Xinjiang. You take over Xinjiang, which has been under our control for the last 15 years, and you exploit these resources and you supply us these raw materials. And in return, we'll give you armaments. Now, Mao was very clear that if China had to be a strong country, it had to have a close relationship with the Soviet Union, and it had to be subservient to the Soviet Union. So the first invasion of India by the Chinese was at the instigation of Comrade Stalin, and it was supported by Soviet aerial reconnaissance, and Chinese troops moved in and they decided to build this road. Now, I have driven through the entire southwestern Tibetan plateau from Lhasa to Mount Kailash. And I drove there in 2002. And it took me 6 days to drive there on Kacha Pakka roads in a Land Cruiser. So you can imagine that in 1950, if the Chinese had to build a road to Lhasa from Xinjiang into Western Tibet and then to Lhasa, it would have taken them at least 2 to 3 years. Because there was no technology, and there were the formidable mountains, the Himalayas, and the Tibetan plateau. So this whole thing about this road was to prevent the Indian army from retaining its encampment in Ghatok, because we had 120 troops in Ghatok of the Indian army. They were led by a major, and the Russians wanted a wall of secrecy over their nuclear program, which was in Xinjiang, near the Xinjiang Soviet border, and they wanted the Indian army removed from there. So they built this entire fiction that, look, this road has to be built, and that road was built up to Ghatok, which is on the periphery of Tibet. It takes you such a long time to get into central Tibet. How can you control Tibet by controlling Ghatok? So the reason was primarily to get at the nuclear minerals, to get at the river, the Karkash River, and to build this road, and then to use the Chinese to force the Indian army out of Ghatok. So that's what happened in 1950. Mm-hmm. And then when we come to 1960, we find that the Chinese had set up this nuclear monitoring, nuclear testing site in Loknor. Now in 1960, 106th Squadron of the Indian Air Force, which had been equipped with Canberra bomber reconnaissance aircraft, PR-57 Canberras, was tasked with doing a photo reconnaissance of entire Tibet and half of Xinjiang, including Southeast Xinjiang. Now, these reconnaissance flights started in 1960 January and continued till 1962 August. In fact, in 1962, between April and July, the Chinese lodged 180 protests about the incursions of violations of their airspace by the IAF. Now, if you are lodging 180 protests in the course of 4 months, that your airspace is being violated, that means you can't defend your airspace. That means you don't have air force over there. That means you don't have anti-aircraft guns over there. And why are you so worried about these incursions if it's a kind of a barren land where not even a blade of grass grows? It is because the IAF, somehow or the other, managed to take aerial reconnaissance photographs of what was happening at the Chinese nuclear program in Loknor. And they were very worried. Now, interestingly, this material was being collected under the orders of Air Marshal Engineer, who was the IAF chief, and then given to Mr. Bholanath Malik, who was the IB chief. Now, very interestingly, from 1947 to 1971, the Intelligence Bureau had a special liaison officer from MI5 of Britain posted in New Delhi, whose job was to go every morning to the IB office and find out what is the latest intelligence that they have collected about the Soviet Union or China or anything that interests the British. Now, this intelligence of the aerial photographs of Loknor and Tibet were given to the special liaison officer every day, that whenever the new photographs came in, because you can imagine that if there were 180 flights during 4 months of 1962, in 1961 and 1960, there could have been another at least 400-500 flights. So all this very valuable and precious material was given to British intelligence free of cost by the IB. And the British had a Soviet spy in their midst. It was a famous man called Kim Philby. And Kim Philby was son of an ICS officer. He was born in Ambala. He spoke fluent Punjabi. But I don't have the evidence to prove that these photographs flowed to Philby from the MI5 headquarters. And then through Philby, they went to Moscow. And from Moscow, they went to Peking. So the Chinese knew what we were doing through a circuitous route from London, Moscow, and then to Peking. Mm-hmm. And the reason why Mao actually invaded Aksai Chin in 1962 was to prevent these flights from happening, so that the Chinese nuclear program, when they detonated their bomb in, I think, 63 or 64, would be unmolested by either the British or the Americans or the Indians. At that point of time, if we had wanted and we had bold political leadership, we could have bombed the Chinese nuclear sites at Loknor. I mean, we were them. We were taking photographs, and the same aircraft could be used to bomb them.
Sure. I'll come to that, Mr. Malhotra, but before that, let's just just rewind a little bit and try to see things from the beginning. Let's say in 1949. Now, the key issue that you state here is when Prime Minister Nehru had gone to the US and met President Truman, he should have agreed to become, a strategic ally of the US and not taken a neutral position when it came to the Cold War. Now, my question to you would be, and you can say it from your book and how you sort of researched it. It was just 2 years into the Indian independence. Do you think it would have been a wise decision for Prime Minister Nehru to take a bold step as becoming, as bold as becoming a strategic ally of the US at that point of time? Because we did not really know how the world would be shaping up post the Cold War. And we ourselves were just fresh out of, more than 200 or 250 years of British rule. How do you analyze that?
You see, the interesting thing is that in 1962, after the Chinese invasion of India, Mr. Nehru went crying to the Americans and said, give me arms, give me air force, give me air power, give me US planes. When he went crying to the Americans in 1962, shorn of all his dignity and self-respect, why couldn't he have, with dignity and self-respect, signed a deal with the Americans and gradually phased into a program of actually containing China? Now, you see, this is the paradox. On the one hand, he was professing non-alignment. On the other hand, there was an active program of engaging with the CIA right through the 1950s and the 1960s. The CIA set up Establishment 22. The CIA set up the Aviation Research Center. The CIA set up the Special Center for conducting sabotage behind Tibetan lines. Right from 1952 to 53, clandestinely, the CIA was supplying arms with Indian assistance into Tibet. Who were the troops of Establishment 22 in the Special Frontier Force who have distinguished themselves in this year in the Galwan Valley and in the Spangur Gap? These Tibetans were the same people from the Chushi Gandrug resistance that was fighting the communist Chinese in 1956, 57, 58, 59. And then they came into the Mustang region of Nepal. And we were engaging with the Americans, and they sent their CIA team here, 8-member team that stayed here for 4 years to actually set up this Establishment 22 Special Frontier Force. So we were engaging with the Americans, but Mr. Nehru had this unfathomable desire to be known as the patron saint of non-alignment. And he wanted this whole concept to be achieved at any cost. And he, in fact, moved the perimeter of Indian defense from the Tibetan-Chinese border right up to the Indian border and even beyond, because of this woolly-headedness, what I call woolly-headedness, because, see, every country has to have a national objective, a national security objective. Sardar Patel was very clear Before he died, he left a letter with instructions, and he called Mr. Daulat Ram, who was the governor of NEFA, as Arunachal and Assam was then known as Northeast Frontier Agency. And he told him that, look, you have to take Tawang because Nehru will not permit it. So Governor Daulat Ram, aided by the chief secretary of NEFA, who was one Parsi gentleman, they actually sent Major Bob Cathing into Tawang, and they retrieved Tawang and they consolidated India's hold over it. Otherwise, if it had been left to Nehru, even Tawang would have gone to China. So the point is this, that when you have an adversarial relationship with a country, you have been in that country for 100 years. You have been selling it opium. You have enslaved 25% of its population and made them into opium addicts. Their entire political class detests you because they believe that you're a running dog of imperialism. You're a running dog of capitalism. They are plotting against you. In 1950, they invade you. In 1952, General Karyapa sent a reconnaissance mission under Captain Nath, and that found out how much the Chinese had encroached into India. And Mr. Nehru kept on denying it. He kept on saying not a blade of grass grows in Aksai Chin. It's a worthless salt flat. Then why were the Russians and the Chinese so interested in it? The world knew what was happening, but he was like an ostrich burying his head in the sand. So my argument is that if you had to do that then, and you're doing that today, what did you gain by befriending China and building this entire edifice of non-alignment? Were you not interested in India's own security, in India's own development, in India's own growth? I mean, there's a trade-off that exists. You cannot pursue the interest and hand over security and hand over territory to the Chinese for the sake of non-alignment.
Okay, but do you think that sort of perspective has changed today? Because even today, when we are having this bitter standoff where we have also seen bloodshed with the Galwan Valley incident, do you think even today's government is sort of shying away from naming China on the international forum, or probably being, again, very soft with China? Do you think that sort of is going to be the strategy no matter what?
See, I think that the Chinese have penetrated into corporate India. And after all, all the 3G networks and the 4G networks in India have been built by Huawei. And Chinese companies have come into, apart from telecom, they've come into mobile phones, they've come into steel, they've come into automobiles, they've come into chemicals. And we have been facing a deindustrialization of the Indian economy because of Chinese competition. Now, I am not an autarkic economist. I mean, I'm an economist by training, but I believe in free trade. But I also believe in protecting and providing an open playing field. You cannot just let the Chinese completely wipe out our industrial base. I mean, the thing is so shocking today that even agarbattis are made by the Chinese and exported to India. I mean, this is, incredible. So these economic interests and the economic stakes that corporate India has with the Chinese would definitely have moderated this government's response to the incursions of 2020 that began in April and May. However, I feel, and this is my argument, that what changed the dynamic was the Ghatak commandos of that 16 Bihar regiment, who, to avenge the death of their commanding officer, attacked the Chinese in their camps and killed over 100 Chinese soldiers. Now, that vicious and brutal counterattack tempered things, and because all those soldiers from the Bihar regiment came from different parts of India, the whole of India was enraged. It was not like just Bihar was enraged, but the whole of India, South India, Central India, Northern India. And the social media came up and people suddenly arose, and public opinion forced the government to acknowledge the role of these commandos who had stolen the initiative, and then forced the government to take a tougher line. And then you found that the Chinese were trying to overrun Taiwan. They were having problems with Australia. And then we discovered our spine that we had lost for 70 years. I think in 2020, we've discovered our spine once again. And that is a good thing, so that we know that, look, we have to stand up the Chinese. We have accepted and paid obedience to this concept of non-alignment for too long, it's time to bury it. And the new name for non-alignment is strategic autonomy. I agree with strategic autonomy, but today's Cold War is a Cold War of technology. Either you're with the Americans or you're with the Chinese. You cannot be in between because there's no place for in between. You have to choose a side. And even Chanakya says that if your enemy's enemy is your friend. Now, who is China's enemy? It's the US. So it's our friend. Simple as that. I'm not a votary for the US. I'm just saying that in this era of real politics, we have to catch the bull by the horns and figure out who are our friends. The Japanese are our friends. The Australians are our friends. The Americans are our friends. So let's use this friendship to face up to the Chinese and tell them we are not a pushover. We are a nation which has got dignity and self-respect and pride, and we will defend ourselves, come what may.
Also, an interesting aspect in your book is about how you, write in a lot of details on how Stalin sort of prodded Chairman Mao to move into Aksai Chin. How do you think the dynamics worked out at that time, and do you think the similar aspect is again happening between the Soviets and the Chinese in the present times?
Let me just jump from 1950. I'll come back to Stalin. In 1962, what emboldened Mao to invade India was Khrushchev's support. Now, Khrushchev was an opportunist. He wanted Chinese support for the medium-range nuclear missiles that he placed in Cuba pointing at the US. He thought Kennedy was a young man, playboy, naive guy. He's not going to do anything. And we'll be able to dominate the US with our missiles in Cuba. He got it wrong. But for those 3 vital weeks, and I provided the evidence, he gave the Chinese support, and the Mao didn't have aviation fuel, and he provided aviation fuel, the guarantee of aviation fuel, and the Chinese then moved into India. Without Soviet support, in 1962, the Chinese could not have moved into India. And then, if you go back to 1949, Stalin wanted to exploit the resources of this entire Xinjiang region, the Tarim Basin, Aksai Chin. He also believed that India, by joining the British Commonwealth, was in the Western Alliance, and if a war broke out between the Soviet Union and the Western Alliance, then Indian bases would be used by the Allies to bomb Soviet targets. He never sent a message of condolence when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. Now, this was the Soviet Union's dictator who did not even send a condolence message. This is the level of bad taste that Stalin displayed as an individual. And till 1953, after all, you see, there's this great controversy about Subhash Chandra Bose and whether he died in the plane crash. And I've done 2 films that have shown the evidence that he went into the Soviet Union because he had no other choice. They had control over his wife and daughter. And, he was being hunted as a war criminal. So the Soviets had their own game to play. They were not friendly with India. It's only when they decided that the Chinese had now gotten out of hand and they wanted a balancing factor, they decided to make friends with us because they wanted to wean us away from the American camp. And if they hadn't weaned us away, Prime Minister Shastri, if he'd been alive, he would have taken us into the Western Alliance. So today also, Putin knows that, look, his main enemy is the US and China. So he balances India against China, and he balances China against the US. He supplies arms to India, he supplies arms to China. The Chinese helicopters that they've copied the design from the Soviets, and the Chinese JF whatever planes, they are malfunctioning. So they're buying them again from the Russians because this reverse engineering doesn't work all the time. It works some of the time. So again, you find that the same situation exists as it existed in 1962. The Russians are tilting towards the Chinese, and India has tilted towards the Americans, because that's where our interest lies. And the government of India today realizes that, look, they cannot, hedge their bets all the time. This time has come to, choose a side, because otherwise we'll be shut out of the technology race. and the Chinese have betrayed us and they will screw us. They've got Pakistan on the one side. The Pakistan army is integrated as a part of the Chinese army. They work in synchronicity. The Chinese want, they've built $15 billion worth of dams on the Indus River in POK, and they want to ensure that the flow of water through from the Jangchemo River, the Galwan River, the Shyok River, the Nubra River into the Indus is allowed to go unimpeded into POK, and this water is surging these days because of glacial melt, and they need this water for their semiconductor industry. So it's a situation where the world is polarized. We are with the democracies, with the Quad, and the Chinese, the Russians, the Turks, the Pakistanis, the North Koreans are on one side, and the Iranians probably, and the battle lines are being drawn. I mean, we are moving into this contest where there are two clear sides. And how this contest manifests itself, I don't know. It will probably play out over the next few months.
But we do continue to depend a lot on Russia still when it comes to our defense purchases. How do you see that?
Yeah, we do, because traditionally, we have been buying weapons from Russia, and they've been the only country that's been willing to sell us those sophisticated weapons. And we owe a debt to them. Definitely, they've helped us out. They've helped us out in '71, but then they've also extracted their pound of flesh. So, I mean, we have to now, if we are going to, integrate, and this new BECA agreement that's been signed means that Indian communications have to integrate with American communications. So we'll have to start now buying more and more Western weapons and fewer Russian weapons. So I think that's an issue that it's a price that we have to pay at some point. We have to bite the bullet, because if we have to defend ourselves with Western arms, then we have to then phase out our reliance on Soviet arms and get into the Western game. But we should have built our own arms industry, which unfortunately we haven't over the last 70 years, despite the fact that we made all those noises in the 50s and 60s about self-reliance. Today it's called Atmanirbharta. It's the same concept that was floated in Nehru's time. It's the same concept in Mr. Modi's time. Nothing's changed.
Mm-hmm. Also, in your book, and that's the chapter I sort of found most interesting, and I finished it in about a day or two, is how you do this comparative sort of analysis, I will call it, because you've dealt it with in a very clinical manner. Is this the comparison between Prime Minister Nehru and Mao Zedong? And how Mr. Nehru was sort of tricked into it, and how the CIA came for the help. Can you discuss a little bit on that? That's, I think, for readers also will be the most interesting chapter that they'll go back to.
You see, Mr. Mao Zedong was a very interesting figure, and he was a very clever and crafty man. Mr. Nehru was, trained in the British tradition. He went to a British public school. He went to Cambridge, which is also my old university. And so he was, he played by what they call the Queensberry rules, that there are certain rules of the game. And he realized that he had to use the Chinese to give birth to this whole concept of non-alignment. And in the process, if he had to kowtow to Mao, he had to do it. Now, if you read the transcripts of the conversations that Mr. Nehru had with Mao in 1954, where it is almost humiliating to see the way Nehru supplicated before Mao. Now, Mao was a ruthless practitioner of ethnopolitics. He slaughtered people, he killed millions of people, he moved people from one region to the other. And Nehru was always referring to him as a man of peace. And he referred to the president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, as a man of war. I mean, so you find that Nehru wanted something from the Chinese, but he could never articulate it. He could never be frank. He could never be like a fisherwoman in a market bargaining for a fish and saying, "Humko itna paisa de do." He could not do that because his training did not equip him to be that kind of skilled negotiator, skilled bargainer. So we needed a prime minister like Patel to have actually secured those things for us. Mao wrapped Nehru around his finger. However, what was happening in between was that Mr. Malik, Bholanath Malik, who was the IB chief, he was an anti-communist and pro-American. He was undermining Nehru from within. The Americans were also undermining Nehru. If the government of India had used the Air Force in 1962 in the war against the Chinese, we would never have lost the war. We would have defeated the Chinese. But Mr. Malik, Bholanath Malik, wanted India to lose because if India lost, then he could have implemented his pro-American plans. And his pro-American plans were that all the intelligence agencies to be set up had to be set up with American help, which was the ARC, Aviation Research Center, Establishment 22, and the Special Center. Mr. Galbraith wanted India to lose so that India would come right into the American camp because there'd be no other choice. So this was what was undermining Nehru from within. Also, there was Mr. Krishna Menon, who was the defense minister, who believed that if the Indian army was allowed a free hand, it would become so strong that, and they would win the war against the Chinese, it would become so strong that it would conduct or execute a military coup like the Pakistan army had done in Pakistan. So right from the start, Mr. Nehru regarded the Indian army as a vestige or as a remnant of British colonialism. And he wanted to undercut and tame and downsize the army and humiliate it in such a manner that it could never realize any latent, dormant political ambitions. Mm-hmm. So when the army was so demoralized over 10, 12 years, how do you expect them, any decisive leader in the army, any decisive general, whether it be Thimaya, whether it be Thorat, whether it be Karyapa, all of them were undermined by Nehru. And he brought in weak generals to lead the Indian army. And he brought in an Army Service Corps officer, Lieutenant General Kaul, who knew nothing about fighting battles, to head an infantry detachment in Nefa. So there were these cross currents that were floating around, because what Mr. Nehru was trying to do was to dismantle the feudal structure of India. And he regarded the army, the zamindars, and the ICS, and the civil service, and the Indian police service as remnants of that feudal structure. Sardar Patel wanted to retain them because he was a very practical person, and he realized that, look, India needs this structure to grow and for this country to become strong. The problem was in the perception of who your enemy is outside and who your enemy is within. Now, Nehru was fighting the communists in India. Mrs. Gandhi pulled down the communist government in Kerala in 1959. There was communist agitation in Telangana. The communists were being put into jail. But on the other hand, he was wooing the communists, and they were then supporting the communists from outside, was supporting the communists inside. The CPI used to go regularly for its meetings to Moscow. What was Stalin doing? He was using those communists to undermine the government. And you are kowtowing to Stalin, saying he's a great man of peace. I mean, anyone who calls Stalin a man of peace deserves to have his head examined. Mr. Nehru used to call Stalin a man of peace. So these were the paradoxes that coexisted, the cross currents that coexisted, and therefore there were so many contradictions. I guess you could say that it's the price that we paid for enabling our democracy to grow and be nurtured. But still, you've got to figure out what your national interest is. And that's my main grouse with Mr. Nehru, that he wasn't able to figure out what India's national interest was and where it lay.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So I'll really come to my last question and close this in the sense, trying to analyze, and right now we're in a very difficult position with the Chinese, yet we are sort of aligning now much more clearer, in a much more clearer manner than what we used to do. I would not say whether it's right or wrong, but we are now doing this Quad exercise. We are part of the Quad group. We are now looking at parallel supply chains when it comes to business and trade, with creating minilaterals within the Indo-Pacific. So do you think that change has sort of started? And also with the pandemic going on, China looks like it's back in business, whereas every other economy is sort of, still struggling to get up. Do you think going forward with this pandemic, people will, every economy or every country in the world, and including India, would think before it aligns with China, but we do see how China is now going to do a big sort of, a greater deal with Iran, and it is also aligning with other like-minded countries. We also have Pakistan. We know the Chinese influence within India's immediate neighborhood. So with all this dynamics, happening around geopolitically, how do you see the coming time for the future?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I'll just rewind to a few days ago when Mr. Mike Pompeo was over here in India, and he came for the 2+2 meeting. And he said that he kept on talking about the Communist Party of China as being distinct from the Chinese people. And I think that's a very good and a very important distinction. The Chinese people are not our enemy. The enemy is the Communist Party of China. And the enemy is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, which is Mr. Xi Jinping.
Yes,
now,
in fact, Secretary of State, in fact, said that in an interview to the Prince. So
yes,
good that
and the fact of the matter is this, that you see, the Chinese have this tremendous advantage in the terms of trade and in manufacturing, because they have almost zero interest rate on debt, and they have they are permitting the Chinese labor market to be exploited by the rest of the world. So no country in the world can compete with China as far as manufacturing goes. And we have all, including India, the US, Britain, every country has built the prosperity of the last 20, 25 years on the exploitation of Chinese labor. Now, we cannot replicate the same cost structure in India or anywhere else in the world that the Chinese have today. We have to buy from China, but we also need to sell to China. China needs to buy from us, and China needs to buy from us on the same kind of terms that it sells to us. So I think what we are going to see, what the purpose of this alignment of the Quad is, where you've got the French who are also knocking on the doors to join the Quad, you've got the Germans coming in as well. They realize that the problem has arisen because of the surpluses that have been generated as a result of China's trade with the rest of the world. These surpluses are now being misused by the Communist Party of China to expand Chinese presence and to become the #1 dominant global power, the center of the world, the center of the universe, which was the concept of the Great Unified Empire, which was first expressed in 700 BC during the Eastern Zhou period of Chinese history. Now, the fact of the matter is this, that we need China as a low-cost manufacturing base. We will develop other supply chains. We will build up our own industry. We will do all these things in India. But as you know, India is a very complex society, and it's very difficult to push through things and laws and regulations very fast. We can't react so fast. It takes time for us to react. We had two pioneering people who saved us. That was Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh in 1991, and enabled this success story to take place. Now we can't let this fritter away. So I think what the Quad and the expanded Quad is going to seek to do is to see that how the regime can be changed in China, because that's the only way out. It's only when this clique of Xi Jinping goes, that and a new clique comes in that renegotiates the terms of trade. There'll be a new general agreement on trade and tariffs. There'll be new terms of trade, which will not be weighed in China's favor, but will be weighed equally and equitably with the rest of the world. Because we can't run up trade deficits of $50-60 billion every year, because we are paying the Chinese to arm themselves against us and to arm the Pakistanis against us. If you look at it, where's this money going? It's going to China. So how do we rectify this balance, this imbalance? This is the most critical issue that this government needs to address, that how do you rectify this trade imbalance? How do you bring it down? How do you develop alternative supply chains? And how do you actually use countervailing pressure to force the Chinese to change the terms of trade with which they trade with the rest of the world? And I think this is where the help of America, Germany, France, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, every damn country in the world will be needed to actually bring this about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that fascinating discussion, Mr. Malhotra. I'll once again show the book. This is Red Fear, The China Threat, and it's an interesting cover. I must say, a Bloomsbury India publication, and this was the print soft cover.
Actually, I designed the cover myself because I'm, a filmmaker. So
of course.
Wow. And so I wanted the red flag and the coronavirus and the history all to be reflected in those images.
Mm-hmm. And that is why it is sort of standing out in the bookstores also if you visit some of the key bookstores in the country. But thank you so much for speaking to us. You please take care.
Thank you, Naina. Thank you so much.